Title: The Day Attica Exploded, Untold Stories from Inside the Riot. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins. The day Attica exploded. The spark that ignited the bloodiest prison uprising in American history. On the morning of September 9, 1971, Attica Correctional Facility looked like any other maximum security prison in upstate New York: gray walls, razor wire fences, and a heavy silence that hung in the air like fog. But inside those walls, pressure had been building for years. No one knew it yet, but within hours Attica would become the center of a national crisis, a battleground, and the site of one of the deadliest prison confrontations the United States had ever seen. For many inmates, the day began with the same frustrations that had grown unbearable: overcrowded cells, ice-cold showers, rotten food, and forced labor for pennies. But what pushed tensions beyond the breaking point was something deeper. Men who felt invisible, degraded, and trapped in a system that refused to hear them. Attica held more than 2,200 inmates, but only a fraction of them had access to meaningful programs, education, or rehabilitation. Letters to the warden went unanswered. Grievances piled up. Every day felt like another reminder that their voices didn't matter. One inmate described the feeling as walking around with gasoline on your skin. One spark and everything burns. That spark came during morning recreation. A simple confrontation between correction officers and a group of prisoners escalated faster than anyone expected. A prisoner was accused of being disruptive, shoved, and dragged away. Rumors rippled through the yard. They're beating him. They're taking him to segregation. Same thing they did last week. No one knew exactly what happened, but the inmates had seen enough to believe the worst. Years of anger hardened into a single decision: this ends today. As more inmates gathered, guards tried to regain control, but the atmosphere shifted. Men who usually stayed quiet stepped forward. Voices rose. And then, like a chain reaction, chaos erupted. A group of inmates forced open a gate inside a block, pushing past surprised officers. Another group seized the opportunity and broke into a tunnel corridor. The prison's alarm system blared through concrete hallways as officers hurried to seal off sections of the facility. But it was too late. Doors failed. Keys were lost. Hundreds of inmates flooded into passageways that were never supposed to be open. Within minutes, Attica was no longer a prison. It was an uprising. Inmates overpowered several guards, some shoved to the ground, others restrained and taken as hostages. More than 1,200 prisoners surged into D Yard, the largest outdoor yard, transforming it into a makeshift stronghold. Here, behind the walls and towers, the inmates gained control. Some shouted for revenge. Others begged for calm, terrified that the uprising would spiral into a bloodbath. In the middle of the chaos, a few leaders stepped forward. Men who understood that what happened next would shape history. They demanded discipline, not destruction. "No one touches the hostages," one leader shouted. "We're not here to kill. We're here to be heard." For the first time in decades, Attica's inmates felt a sense of unity. Black, white, Latino. Men who normally kept to their racial groups stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by a shared desperation for dignity. From guard towers above, officers watched the growing crowd with fear and disbelief. Radio calls spilled across the state as the warden issued an urgent alert. Attica is in full riot. By noon, news helicopters buzzed above the prison walls. Families gathered outside the gates. State troopers and National Guard units were already mobilizing. Inside D Yard, inmates formed a negotiation team and began listing their demands: better medical care, fair disciplinary hearings, religious freedom, adequate food, and amnesty for the uprising. They weren't asking for freedom, they were asking for humanity. But outside those walls, powerful men believed something very different was happening. To state officials, the events at Attica weren't a protest. They were a threat that had to be crushed before it spread. That misunderstanding would lead to an impossible standoff. And by the time it was over, 43 people would be dead. The uprising had begun, but the darkest hours were still to come. For the next 24 hours, Attica Correctional Facility transformed into a fortress held together by desperation. The inmates controlled D Yard, standing in a wide circle beneath the guard towers where rifles glinted under the gray September sky. 42 correction officers and civilian employees lay bound on the ground or seated against the wall, hostages, terrified, their lives hanging on every decision made inside and outside the prison. Yet something extraordinary happened. The yard wasn't filled with chaos. It was organized. Inmates built makeshift tents using blankets and bedsheets. Others formed medical stations to treat injured prisoners and hostages. A few men stood on overturned crates, speaking to the crowd through a bullhorn, trying to keep order. More than 1,000 inmates, many hardened by years behind bars, were now united by a single belief: this was their one chance to be heard. Outside Attica's walls, the situation became the biggest law enforcement crisis New York had ever faced. The state police arrived in full force. The National Guard waited on standby. Reporters clamored for answers. Families of both inmates and hostages gathered at the gates, praying for news. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a man with presidential ambitions, followed everything closely from Albany. His advisors urged him to go to Attica, to show leadership and hear the inmates' demands firsthand. But Rockefeller refused. Visiting the prison he believed would make him look weak. Inside the yard, negotiations began. The inmates selected a committee of representatives, men who could read, who had education, who had the trust of different racial groups. One of them stood tall on a table, holding a sheet of paper that would echo across history. The list of 28 demands. These demands were not wild or impossible. They asked for basic medical care, sanitary living conditions, access to education, religious freedom, fair trials and parole hearings, no physical retaliation for the uprising. As the list was read aloud, the yard erupted in applause. These were not the demands of a mob, they were the demands of human beings begging for dignity. To ensure transparency, the inmates invited observers, journalists, civil rights leaders, politicians, and mediators to enter the prison and witness events firsthand. Among them were Tom Wicker, a New York Times editor, and William Kunstler, the famous civil rights attorney. When the observers entered the yard, they were stunned by what they saw. Wounded inmates helping hostages drink water. Groups sitting peacefully while others cleaned the yard. No signs of the violence the public had been told to expect. One observer whispered, "It feels like a society trying to rebuild itself." But the peace was fragile. Every hour, the warden reported to Albany, and every hour, the situation became more political. State officials insisted the inmates were violent, irrational, and dangerous, claims that did not match what observers saw. But the narrative outside the walls began to shift, painting the prisoners as unstable and violent. Inside the yard, fear began to grow. The inmates knew the state police outside were gathering weapons. Helicopters circled above at night, shining spotlights through the fences. Troopers rehearsed assault formations in the prison parking lot. Hostages begged the negotiation team to keep the peace. "I have a family," one said through tears. "Please don't let them storm this place." Meanwhile, the inmates debated their next move. Hundreds wanted to hold firm, but others feared the inevitable. Some thought surrender might save lives. Others believed surrender meant certain torture or death. The tension reached a breaking point when the inmates' most important demand, amnesty from prosecution, was denied outright by Governor Rockefeller. It was the one promise that could have ended everything peacefully. Instead, Rockefeller issued a firm message. No negotiations. Retake the prison by force if necessary. When news of Rockefeller's refusal reached the yard, panic rippled through the inmates. They knew what it meant. The state was preparing for an assault. They heard it in the helicopters, saw it in the tightening perimeter, felt it in the nervous whispers of the guards above them. As night fell on September 12th, the observers pleaded with the state for more time. They warned that a violent assault would lead to catastrophe. Rockefeller again refused to come. Inside the prison, the hostages huddled together, crying, praying, and clutching each other's hands. Many inmates began writing letters to their families, believing the next sunrise might be their last. By dawn on September 13th, the sun rose over a yard filled with fear, exhaustion, and silence. The standoff was over. The assault was coming. And the bloodiest day in American prison history was about to begin. At 9:46 a.m. on September 13, 1971, the sky above Attica turned dark with the thudding blades of a state police helicopter. Inside the yard, more than 1,000 inmates, exhausted, terrified, many already saying their goodbyes, looked up as the machine hovered over them. Hostages knelt on the ground with their hands tied, shaking, whispering prayers, hoping they would survive the next few minutes. From the loudspeaker came a chilling announcement. "This is the state of New York. Surrender immediately." The inmates shouted that they were willing to negotiate, that observers needed more time, that they didn't want violence. But the message fell on deaf ears. Governor Rockefeller had already made his choice, and the assault team had already taken their positions. Then the helicopter dropped its payload. A blinding white cloud exploded over the yard, CS tear gas, thick and burning, descending like a toxic fog. Men collapsed choking. Hostages screamed. Prisoners stumbled in circles, blinded, gasping for air but finding none. Those closest to the cloud vomited where they stood. And that was the moment hundreds of armed troopers charged. State police, correction officers, and sheriff's deputies stormed through the gates wearing gas masks and carrying shotguns, pistols, and rifles. They were not trained in riot control. They were not instructed to shoot selectively. Many later admitted they could barely see through the haze, but they fired anyway. Gunfire erupted from all sides, echoing across the concrete walls like thunder. Dozens of prisoners fell instantly. Others ran blindly, tripping over bodies, hands up, shouting for mercy. Some curled into the fetal position, hoping bullets would miss them. But the troopers kept firing. Many were given no warnings and no orders to hold back. When the smoke cleared just enough for visibility, the scene was apocalyptic. Bodies stacked across the yard, men bleeding from chest wounds, throat wounds, head wounds, injuries consistent not with rubber bullets but with live ammunition. Within 6 short minutes, the assault was over. And 43 men lay dead. 29 inmates. 10 hostages. 4 more inmates killed earlier during the uprising. But the true horror had only begun. The cover-up. Almost immediately, the state tried to rewrite the story. Officials held a press conference claiming that the hostages had been killed by inmates, who allegedly slit their throats during the chaos. It was a lie, one the state repeated to the press, to the families, and to the world. Inside the prison, surviving inmates were dragged across the yard, stripped naked, beaten with clubs, forced to crawl through mud and glass, and marched past the bodies of their friends. Some troopers carved racist slurs into prisoners' backs. Others forced inmates to lie on broken bottles, threatening to shoot anyone who moved. Meanwhile, the dead hostages lay on stretchers, their families frantic outside the gates, begging for answers. Hours later, a medical examiner named Dr. John Edland made a discovery that would expose the truth. Every hostage had been killed by police bullets, not a single throat had been cut. He refused to participate in the cover-up. He refused to lie for the governor. And he paid for it, attacked publicly, pressured politically, smeared in the media. But the truth was out. Rockefeller's assault had caused all 10 hostage deaths. The state had turned its guns not only on inmates, but on the very men they were supposed to rescue. The aftermath. Attica became a national scandal. Lawsuits piled up. Journalists demanded answers. Survivors described torture, humiliation, and trauma that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Yet Governor Rockefeller never apologized. He never visited Attica. He never acknowledged that the state's actions contributed to the massacre. Many of the inmates who survived were charged with crimes related to the uprising, but almost all the charges collapsed under scrutiny. Meanwhile, not a single officer or trooper was criminally convicted for the killings or brutality that followed the assault. For decades, the state denied responsibility, until 2000, nearly 30 years later, when New York finally agreed to pay a $12 million settlement to inmates and hostages' families. Even then, many said money could never replace what was lost. Inside Attica, the scars remained, bullet holes in the catwalks, patched concrete on the yard floor, memories that haunted both prisoners and officers for the rest of their lives. The legacy of Attica. The Attica Uprising became a turning point in American prison history. It forced the country to confront questions it had ignored for too long. Why were conditions so inhumane? Why were inmates' rights repeatedly violated? How did a peaceful negotiation turn into a massacre? And why did the state value force over human life? To this day, Attica symbolizes the explosive consequences of neglect, abuse, and hopelessness. It's a reminder that when people are pushed beyond the brink, when their humanity is stripped away, violence becomes inevitable. As one survivor later said, Attica didn't explode in a day. It exploded after decades of silence. The world may remember the massacre, but those who lived through it remember something even deeper. The moment they realized their lives mattered less than the lies used to justify their deaths.